The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Okay, I want to start today with a story that's sort of about Beto O'Rourke, but it's really a story more generally about campaign finance and about Republicans and Democrats and political philosophy. And so in the beginning, it's going to seem like I'm sort of picking on Beto O'Rourke, and a lot of people in the audience don't like Beto, so they want me to be picking on Beto O'Rourke. And to quote Donald Trump, there's plenty of material there if that's what I wanted to do. But I want to sort of set this up for you based on the facts, and then we'll have a discussion that I think is an important one. Beto O'Rourke, running as a Democrat for president in 2020, he, for a while, was making the claim that he did not accept money from lobbyists. And that claim has been sort of quietly removed. It's just disappeared from his fundraising emails after it was revealed by The Intercept that he, along with some other 2020 presidential candidates, are actually taking money from lobbyists or have taken money from lobbyists. So I'll put up on the screen for people that are watching along with me. For a long time, Beto was sending out fundraising emails like these, where you see him say no money from lobbyists, or, for example, like this one, where you see him also say no money from lobbyists. And then The Intercept did a piece which exposed that Beto O'Rourke, as well as Kamala Harris and Cory Booker, actually have been taking lobbyist donations. And then suddenly, the fundraising emails by Beto O'Rourke's campaign that were sent out after this Intercept article was published no longer mention anything about no lobbyists. The new one says we're not taking money from PACs, we're not taking money from corporations, we're not taking money from special interests, although special interest is a very sort of vague word to be using, but the mention of lobbyists is gone. So, okay, I get that this is being pushed a lot by anti-Beto people. There are pro-Bernie groups that are pushing this and making a big deal out of it, and this stuff can very quickly get very, very ugly. And there's also sort of a pragmatic reality, which is sometimes you say no PACs, but if you win a primary, all of a sudden you lose control over whether there's PAC money coming in to support you. The use of the term special interests is a vague one. What do we really mean by special interests? My view of this and my goal in doing this story today is not about playing gotcha with Beto O'Rourke or with any particular candidate, because that's really not going to help us win in 2020, which is what I think the number one and almost singular focus needs to be at this point in time, in addition to interfering with as much of the destructive Republican agenda as we can up until the point at which we replace the people currently in power. I have sort of a much more fatalistic and pragmatic view of this, which is that we at some point are going to need to win with the rules that are in place at the time that we're trying to win, if we ultimately want to really get the amount of power that's necessary to change the rules. So this is why when no PAC money became more of a thing, particularly for congressional candidates, I pointed out, this is great. I agree with getting PAC money out, but the people who are doing it are making a calculation they believe they can win without the benefit of that money. It's the ideology of not taking PAC money, but to some degree it's also a pragmatic calculation, which is okay. You've got to make that calculation. There was a discussion back in 2016 about if Bernie Sanders were to have won the 2016 Democratic nomination, he would inevitably have received the benefit of PAC money because the Democratic Party establishment would have used PACs to support Bernie if he had been the nominee. So ultimately, his promise can remain technically true. He's not accepting PAC money, but he'd still benefit from the fact that PAC money would have been out there and helping him, and it would have been beyond his control, and it would have just been a pragmatic reality at the time. That gets us to now. You could imagine a candidate taking the totally principled stance on campaign finance. Imagine a candidate who says, I think that campaigns should be funded by small dollar donations. So not only am I not taking PAC money or taking lobbyist money, whatever. I'm also not taking donations over $250. At some point, the completely correct principled position will lose you the election or make it impossible for you to win, because in the end, more than in most cases, in something like 85% of races, the candidate with more money ends up winning. So I'm against all of these types of campaign funding. I've been against them for years, but I don't believe in unilateral disarmament beyond what makes sense at the time. No PAC money, great. It's the correct moral decision, and in many cases, you can still win without taking PAC money. No lobbyist money, great. It's the right decision. But how exactly are we defining lobbyist money? It's a little bit more amorphous, and if you get rid of everything that could be called lobbyist money, can you still win a presidential election? I don't know the answer. I'm just asking the question. So I want to restate again. I want lobbyist money out. I want PAC money out. I want it all out. Should Beto say he's not taking lobbyist money if he actually is taking it? No, that's what's called lying, and he shouldn't do that. But when our opponents are taking all of this money, at some point you have to just consider that if you reject all of it, you will lose and never be in a position where you can actually change the system so that everybody stops taking this type of money. Make everybody disarm once you're in power rather than unilaterally disarming if it's going to make you lose. If you disagree with my take on this, sometimes people get angry at my pragmatism, just let me know. I want to hear from you. Okay, I've got some clips to play for you today from a recent interview that right-winger Ben Shapiro did on Joe Rogan's podcast. We could do 30 minutes on all of the caveats about Joe Rogan and Ben Shapiro. We can talk about Joe Rogan effectively, according to some, serving as a gateway to the alt-right. We can talk about the ways in which Ben Shapiro appears to be very informed and convincing, but often says things that don't make sense. I've said before, if you listen really closely to Ben Shapiro, you will often realize that even though he's speaking confidently and he's speaking quickly, that what he's saying is actually not making that much sense. And I have a couple of really funny examples of that. And Joe Rogan, I don't even know that Joe Rogan realized how much he exposed Ben Shapiro in the clips that I'm going to play for you today. So to set it up, this gets to a portion of the interview between Ben Shapiro and Joe Rogan, where I guess I would say it's about Ben Shapiro's religious beliefs. And Joe Rogan's asking questions about Ben Shapiro's Orthodox Judaism, and mostly they're talking about homosexuality, which I'm going to get to a little bit later in the clip. But Joe and Ben sort of agree that there are some historical reasons why things became commandments in the Old Testament, for example. They agree that there are some historical realities at the time which explain to us, like, for example, the Bible mentions man shall not lie with another man, or whatever the phrase is. I don't even care. But the line that's pointed to that people point to as saying homosexuality is bad, that wasn't in the Bible because the people who wrote the Bible thought in 1,000 years maybe there will be gay people. It was there because they saw gay people at the time and they decided we're going to put something in the Bible about it. Okay, the example doesn't really matter, but the idea is the Bible reflects things that were happening at the time. So Joe Rogan brings up a sort of naturalistic explanation for why eating pork is not okay in Judaism. It's also not okay in Islam. The same analysis would sort of apply, related to the cooking temperature of pork and bacteria and whatever. You'll hear it in a second. And Ben Shapiro says very clearly he doesn't like naturalistic explanations for this stuff. Check it out and pay really close attention here to what Ben Shapiro says.
Like, the very reason to have a commandment is because certain people in your community are behaving in a particular way, presumably.
Right.
There's no commandment not to take your head and shove it in a meat grinder.
Well, this is also the argument against pork, is because they didn't understand trichinosis. They didn't understand you have to cook the meat to 145 degrees, and pork parasites, which are very dangerous for people.
So I'm not a huge fan of naturalistic explanations for religion.
Don't you think that's a good one, though, for pork?
I mean, I don't know. Like, I think you could make an argument, maybe.
Okay. Ben Shapiro says very clearly he's against naturalistic explanations for religion, meaning he doesn't like explaining religious precepts with sort of real-world justifications from nature. Ben Shapiro said very clearly he's against that. Fine. So then about 90 seconds go by. Okay, this next clip is from 90 seconds after what I just played for you. And Ben Shapiro gives a naturalistic explanation for Moses parting the Red Sea. He just said he's not into naturalistic explanations, and here he gives a naturalistic explanation 90 seconds later.
Do you think he was resurrected?
No, that's not a Jewish belief.
Okay, I just want to check.
Yeah, no, we're not into
You're not
we're not into miracle
zombies?
stories. No, that's
No?
not. No.
You don't have any miracles?
No,
in here?
not by Jesus. Right?
No?
They're ones
But
in the Old
God
Testament.
ones?
Yeah, you've got Moses splitting the sea and all that.
What do you think happened there?
What do I think happened there?
Yeah.
Well, I'll go with the Maimonidean explanation that there was, it says in the Bible there was a strong east wind. So there was a naturalistic explanation for a physical phenomenon.
That makes sense.
I mean, that's what Maimonides is constantly trying to do, is read nature back into the Bible.
Yeah.
He says it's the miracle of Moses parting the Red Sea, and he naturalistically explains it, wind in the Red Sea area, which is a very common naturalistic explanation for the parting of the Red Sea in the Old Testament, which he just said he's not in favor of. He's not in favor of those types of explanations, except all of a sudden when he is. And this reminds me of naturalistic explanations for Noah's Ark. If you talk to some religious people about Noah's Ark, they'll say, no, we've sort of identified where there were floods at the time based on geological records, and here is how it all could have worked, so on and so forth. Never explains how some of the species need salt water and some need fresh water, and how did they get all of that onto the ark for the time it had to be there. It doesn't explain how there are carnivorous animals, and if you only had 2 of each species, didn't any of them get eaten? Did you start with more than 2 and they were eaten down to 2? Or did carnivorous animals get fed some kind of soylent or vegan diet during? None of that stuff is explained, but at least the specifics of the flood are sometimes explained naturalistically with Noah's Ark. This is the same thing here, naturalistically explaining the parting of the Red Sea after saying he doesn't like naturalistic explanations. Now, I know some people will say, David, hold on. Ben Shapiro says Maimonides gives that explanation. It doesn't matter. Ben Shapiro said he's not for naturalistic explanations of religious stories or miracles or phenomena, and then 90 seconds later, he insta-flips on himself. And it was a missed opportunity, actually, for Joe to call him out on that. So then they get back to homosexuality. And to Dave Rubin's marriage to his husband. Dave Rubin is a cultural critic and political commentator who engages in the battle of ideas, where the free market allows the best ideas to float to the top, sort of like fat on milk or butter or whatever. Anyway, they get to Dave Rubin's marriage, which Ben Shapiro has been saying for a while how he would not go to Dave Rubin's wedding, or I guess wouldn't have gone if they had been friends at the time. I don't know that they knew each other at the time. But he'd still have Dave and his husband over for dinner, because going to the wedding goes against his religious beliefs. But I guess having them to dinner doesn't. And Joe Rogan just exposes the idiocy of it so easily.
Right. And one of the things that the reason I keep coming back to the governmental regulation point is because my view is that if your view of discipline is not my view of discipline, good on you. Right? Like, go do what you want to do. Like, I've never had a conversation with Dave Rubin about him being a gay guy.
Right, but you did say that you wouldn't go to his marriage, right?
Well, I said, right, as a religious person, I can't say I can't actively participate in something that I consider to be a sin, but I would go out to dinner with Dave and his husband anytime. Like, my wife and I would do that, of course. We'd have him over to our house with his husband.
You don't find any contradiction between your religious perspective and your personal perspective in that regard? That you wouldn't be there for religious reasons, but that you would be there for personal reasons? Like, if it wasn't, would you go to the after party? Like, if you wouldn't go to the wedding, would you go to the after party?
Anything that was a celebration of same-sex marriage, no.
Wow.
So anything, but
you wouldn't even go to the party?
No. I mean, that's it. And that's that.
What if there was a barbecue the next day? Would you consider it a tag on?
And again, like, I'm not sure why. I'm not a good party person, so I'm not sure why anybody would want me at their party, frankly. I'm kind of a buzzkill.
You'd be a great party. I haven't been to a party with you, but I went to a dinner party with you.
That's true.
We had a great time.
That was a good time. That was a good time.
That's a funny picture, man.
That is a wild
picture. People don't know what to think about that picture.
That is certainly true.
Eric and Jordan
And Sam,
and
it's a
Dave
wild picture.
and
So Joe Rogan's being sort of funny about it. He's very presciently exposing the absurdity of what Ben Shapiro is saying. Going out to dinner with a gay couple who you recognize as a gay couple is recognizing the idea that they are a couple, which his religion considers a sin. It's a very sort of mealy-mouthed, weird gray area to say, well, I wouldn't go to the wedding ceremony because then I would be endorsing something my religion believes is a sin. And I wouldn't go to the wedding reception and just have dinner because I would be recognizing the sin. But like a couple days later, I'd go to dinner with them as a couple, which of course is recognizing them as a couple, which his religion believes is a sin. But that would sort of be okay in Ben Shapiro's mind. And, you know, he says he wouldn't go to anything that celebrates same-sex marriage. I hate to break it to you, but when you go out with a couple who is married and it's a gay couple, you're effectively celebrating, or at minimum recognizing, something that your religion teaches you is a sin. It is the fence sitting that is so mealy-mouthed that I found just laughable here. And here Joe Rogan actually does a really good job when he says, what about the reception? What about a barbecue the day after? Like, at what point is going to hang out with Dave Rubin and his husband disconnected enough from the fact that it's a gay couple that's married under the law that you can sort of rationalize it post facto in a way that feels okay for what your religion teaches? This is why it's all nonsense, and really nice job by Joe Rogan in exposing it. And by the way, Ben Shapiro is welcome on the show anytime. He's been on before. I think at this point he probably, I think he's too big for the David Pakman Show at this point. He's got bigger fish to fry, but open invitation for him anytime. Follow me on Twitter at @dpakman. Follow the show on Twitter at David Pakman Show. I would love to hear from you about this, of course.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Let me say a quick thank you to Eric Simon, who's today's new member of the day. This is a program, unlike what you see on corporate media, that is not funded by huge advertisers who just drop large sums of money on us for us to do whatever we want with. It's funded mostly by our viewers through something called membership. Membership keeps us accountable because we are accountable to you. If the show goes off the rails, we lose membership support, and then we've got to have a real introspective hard look at what we're doing. Eric Simon's today's new member of the day. Rosalind Smackham is today's longtime sustaining member of the day. She's been with us almost 5 years. Eric and Rosalind, thank you. Join them at joinpakman.com. Takes under a minute to sign up, and you get all of the great member benefits, including the bonus show, the commercial-free audio stream, the commercial-free video stream, the members-only newsletter. A lot of really great stuff, and it supports our work, which is extraordinarily important right now. There's a really funny video of Republican Senator Lindsey Graham from 1999, which has sort of been revived, and it tells us exactly why Donald Trump could well be impeached in 2019. Now, it's really important to understand the context, and that what I'm going to play for you is not to make an argument for or against the impeachment of President Donald Trump. It's to tell you that the arguments that Republicans are making today, even Republicans like Lindsey Graham, were ridiculously laughable back in 1999 when it was Bill Clinton that they were talking about impeaching. The term underlying crime has been used a lot lately, and the idea of underlying crime is that if Donald Trump didn't commit any underlying crime, in this case it would be personal collusion with Russia, that you can't impeach or indict him for cover-up related actions or so-called secondary crimes like trying to obstruct the investigation into whether or not he colluded with Russia. And Trump has been continuing to parrot this on Twitter. I mean, it's really getting a lot of oxygen. Trump tweeting, quote, "Only high crimes and misdemeanors can lead to impeachment. There were no crimes by me, no collusion, no obstruction." By the way, no obstruction, that doesn't appear to be true. So you can't impeach. It was the Democrats that committed the crimes, not your Republican president tables are finally turning on the witch hunt. So it turns out that Republican Senator Lindsey Graham actually has something very important to say about this. Why do we care what Lindsey Graham says? Well, we care what Lindsey Graham says because he's become one of the most sort of sycophantic, brown-nosing, unhinged defenders of Donald Trump and anyone that Donald Trump has determined is a good guy at this point in time. Throwing any bad argument has been doing Lindsey Graham time and again to see if it sticks. But Lindsey Graham actually laid out in really simple and clear terms that it actually doesn't matter if there was no underlying crime committed by the president. And Lindsey Graham actually goes further in the clip I'm going to play for you. Lindsey Graham argued in 1999, when it was about Bill Clinton, that it doesn't matter if there was any crime at all, that if the president behaved in a way that smears the United States, that requires the healing of the country after gross acts by the president, even with no crime being committed, or at least any indictment whatsoever, it would still be justified to impeach a president. Here's what Lindsey Graham said. Just apply it to today instead of to Bill Clinton, which is what Lindsey Graham was doing in this clip.
So the point I'm trying to make is you don't even have to be convicted of a crime to lose your job in this constitutional republic. If this body determines that your conduct as a public official is clearly out of bounds in your role, because impeachment is not about punishment. Impeachment is about cleansing the office. Impeachment is about restoring honor and integrity to the office.
So this is why, even though I don't believe there's the political will to impeach Donald Trump at this point in time, because you need some Republicans in order to do it, I don't believe that there is even really the time to carry out the removal of Trump via impeachment. Even if proceedings started today, I believe it's still faster to just vote in November of 2020 and remove the guy from a sort of practical perspective. I do believe that the impeachment debate would be absolutely logical to actually have in earnest in the House of Representatives. Start a House debate about impeachment to determine whether the circumstances justify starting impeachment proceedings in the House, which of course eventually get to the Senate needing to vote to decide what they believe should be done. That makes sense. And Lindsey Graham in this video, which I just played for you, makes it clear that impeachment is not about punishment. I mean, I'm quoting one of the biggest Trump defenders, a Republican here. Impeachment is not about punishment. Impeachment is about cleansing the office, as Lindsey Graham said, and there couldn't possibly be a term that better applies to the White House under Donald Trump and to the people around him than a need to cleanse the office. So it's Lindsey Graham himself who made the case very succinctly and very articulately 20 years ago. He wanted it to apply only to Democratic President Bill Clinton, but it actually applies perfectly to President Donald Trump in 2019. Let's keep talking about impeachment a little bit. Democrats are starting to speak out against Nancy Pelosi and to sort of break with her on the issue of starting impeachment proceedings against Donald Trump. And it's getting really interesting, and it could actually get very damaging for Democrats. And I'll tell you about that and how that would work in a few minutes. If you haven't been following, Nancy Pelosi has been very reticent to take impeachment hearings sort of seriously, even saying a couple of times that Democrats shouldn't go down that path because it divides the country, that Trump is, quote, not worth it in terms of even bothering to impeach him. And the question more and more is that it's not a matter of Trump being worth it. For me, it's a question of whether the country is worth it in terms of what Trump has done and what the correct consequences would be for that. So in any case, as I told you yesterday, talk of impeachment among high-profile Democrats is growing pretty quickly. Elizabeth Warren and Kamala Harris have both said that they support starting the impeachment process against Donald Trump. There are more and more prominent Democrats who have been saying in interviews that Donald Trump has certainly committed impeachable offenses. And now the disagreement between these prominent Democrats and Nancy Pelosi has gone beyond what it was before, which was really, I don't want to insult anybody, but more obscure or less well-known Democrats. You had, Al Green try to actually start impeachment proceedings on the floor of the House. You've got Elizabeth Warren now. You've got Elijah Cummings talking about, if not now, when, how and when will Trump face consequences. Jerry Nadler and Adam Schiff hinting more and more at impeachment would at least be justified, if not the next thing that we want to do. Impeachment would be really difficult to actually see through to the removal of the President of the United States. It's a long process, but there are two ways that this impeachment thing could go without the successful removal of Trump. And Democrats need to make sure they're not on the wrong side of it. Okay, so for the important discussion here for me is not, can Trump be removed via impeachment? Right now, the answer is very clearly no. You need Republicans to do that. Republicans are completely unwilling. 30% of the country is an immutable, unchangeable base for Donald Trump. I call him the shoot someone on Fifth Avenue crowd. So there are really political considerations here, and Democrats could be on one side or they could end up on the other. One path for Democrats is Democrats just keep arguing and being divided about this issue of impeachment, and they hurt themselves by getting into very public disagreements about impeachment, and it ends up hurting them in 2020. That's bad, okay? Democrats need to avoid that. The other path is that Democrats say, at a minimum, we're going to have a floor debate about impeachment, okay? We want to start floor debate about whether impeachment proceedings should start against the President of the United States. They are united on the debate, and the content of the debates becomes newsworthy, and they make impeachment a political problem for Trump in the campaign, okay? If you ask me which I prefer, it's obvious which is better. Democrats arguing about impeachment and hurting themselves, or Democrats uniting and saying the evidence justifies a floor debate about impeachment. Let's at least start that and see if the way that it is picked up in media and the way that Donald Trump reacts hurts Trump, makes this a burden for Trump for the 2020 election. When Bill Clinton lied about oral sex, Republicans were united. You had every sort of echelon with some very minor holdouts saying, this is the right thing, this is what we've got to do, here's why it's justified. They didn't succeed, obviously, in removing Bill Clinton, but they not only had the debate and were united, they actually filed articles of impeachment against Bill Clinton. We now have a president whose egregious behavior exceeds Bill Clinton lying about oral sex by leaps and bounds. And Democrats have the opportunity to use this to help them in defeating Trump in 2020, or they have the opportunity of hurting themselves just by arguing endlessly and publicly about whether there should be any consequences or even potential consequences for what Donald Trump has done, as exposed by the Mueller report. It's a great way to lose yourself another election, and I hope that Democrats get it together and don't go in that direction and go in the direction of being united and saying there have to be consequences, and at minimum, we need a very public debate about whether those consequences should include the filing of articles of impeachment. Not a strategy to remove Trump, but important to be united and to not let this hurt the movement to remove him in 2020. Let me know what you think. We're going to put a poll related to this on the show's Instagram page, which is David Pakman Show on Instagram. And while you're there, follow me on Instagram as well. I'm David.Pakman. I did post this picture from a Passover Seder over the weekend, for which I am getting a lot of hate, which I discussed yesterday on the bonus show. You can check out that picture if you follow me on Instagram at David.Pakman. Quick break, very interesting segment coming up next.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
It's great to welcome back to the program Ralph Nader, who is a political activist, consumer advocate, former presidential candidate, and also author most recently of the book, How the Rats Reformed the Congress. You can get the book and find out much more about it at ratsreformcongress.org. It's so great to have you back on. I appreciate it.
Thank you. It's ratsreformcongress.org.
Yes.
Yeah.
So let's talk a little bit about the idea behind the book and how it relates to real-world activism, because just to give you some context, I have been talking for a long time on my program about calling your elected officials is great, signing petitions on the internet. I don't know really how much it does, but it's a show of support. But that at a certain point, there may need to be something closer to a real revolt by the population if we are to change some of the systemic problems that exist with our system of government in our country. Can you talk about that idea of a revolt and sort of how you tell that story in the book?
Sure. Basically, it starts out with a rat infestation on Capitol Hill. There is actually a rat infestation throughout Washington, D.C., and the rats do what rats do. They go for water and food. They don't have any anthropomorphic quality like Mickey Mouse, and they find that one of the best venues is to go up the pipes into the toilet bowls of the members of Congress. And you can imagine the horror on discovering this by the Speaker of the House and the Minority Leader of the House. And they try to cover it up while they try to deal with the rat infestation scurrying all over the offices. And a reporter exposes it. And then all the press goes wild, making jokes of it, making rat jokes, making jokes of the politician, late-night comedy, TV. Derision spreads all over the country, and people start paying some attention to the Congress. And some active groups and people who weren't active said, hey, let's take advantage of this. While people are looking at the Congress and the spectacle, on national TV and social media, let's mobilize the people. And the rest of the book, after making you laugh yourself seriously, is how Congress rat watcher groups, they're really Congress watchdog groups, can be easily formed in every congressional district, and how mass rallies around Capitol Hill that go on for hours with bullhorns demanding the resignation of the corporate lawmakers and starting to get defectors from the 535 men and women who have so much of our power, and some of them defect and join the crowd. In the meantime, a very representative group of really serious citizens, run by a former stonemason, is developing the agenda and the congressional hearings, and they learn that the faster reform is proposed, instead of being drawn out, the quicker each reform helps each other and builds more and more support. So if some people are interested in living wage, but they're not interested in full Medicare for all, they support full Medicare for all and vice versa. And a lot of these changes are long overdue. They have huge polling support, which means liberals and conservatives support, as they do now, full Medicare for all, living wage, law enforcement against corporate crime, against consumers and workers and the environment, and defenseless communities, bad trade agreements, dealing with the enormously bloated corporate welfare budget, which is draining away from investment in repairing America at the community level. You know, the usual list: schools, highways, bridges, public transit, sewage, drinking water systems are crumbling. And huge public works programs will create good-paying jobs that can't be exported to China, and they will improve public services. Now, who is against that? I mean, the Chamber of Commerce locally is for it. The labor unions are for it. Everybody supports these kinds of renovations and repairs and upgrades. So this book, which is not that long, it is funny in places where it should be, but in humor there is truth. But it gives you a tremendous level of excitement because again and again, as the people are mobilizing and taking back control of Congress. After all, they delegated the power to this tiny branch of government that has the most powerful impact because it's empowered by the Constitution to be more powerful than the executive and judicial branch. It has the taxing power, the spending power, the confirmation of nominees to the judiciary power. It has the war declaring power. It has the investigatory power.
Yeah.
And so people are saying, let's take back control. And every move, and there are a lot of creative moves that people will say, hey, we can do that. Every move meets one test, which is, can anybody stop you, the people, from doing that?
Well,
can
along
anybody
those
stop
lines,
you?
I mean, let me dig into that a little bit. So, if you imagine in the real world, what would be, in your view, a realistic trigger for this sort of level of civil disobedience and revolt that in the book you sort of fictionalize, but it's very prescient in terms of the real world? And the context for me asking that question is, part of the problem with the system we have is that with stagnant wages, with it being so easy to get fired because most jobs don't have any kind of contractual or union protection, all of the things that you know and have been talking about.
Sure.
It's a system that's designed to make it really hard for people to say, we are going to execute a sustained period of revolt and civil disobedience and mass gathering. So what would be big enough to trigger that?
First of all, you got to have a different attitude. Stop using the words resistance and civil disobedience and start using the word takeover of Congress. You have so many people around the country, marches, demonstrations on climate disruption, on bigotry, on civil rights, etc. And they lose all this energy that goes into the ether on a weekend when the demonstrations occur, and it isn't refocused on your two senators and representative, where you summon them to your own people's town meetings and place the agenda of legislation and repeal of bad laws on their table. You see, they come to listen to, and they look over the crowd in the auditorium and they say, hey, there's just conservatives here, the liberals here. How do I game this one? This is going to be rather difficult. And so what this book starts out with are the long overdue improvements in livelihoods that people in Western Europe and Canada have had for decades. So it starts out with the living wage. You have 45 million workers in this country make less than $15 an hour before deductions. You can't live on that. So that's a big mobilizer for this book, in this book. The second is full Medicare for all. Well, you know, the progressives, even progressives, they don't know how to argue this. They argue it in terms of fairness, in terms of health care. They don't say 35,000 people die every year because they can't afford health insurance to get diagnosed and treated in time. They don't say that the system is so corrupt that, according to the leading experts in the field, $350 billion every year goes down the drain in computerized billing, fraud, and abuse in the healthcare area. That's $350 billion with a B. So all these elaborations show people how to argue their case much better. And then, of course, there's a double standard of justice. You don't think the guy in the bar knows that? One standard for people, and a double standard for corporations and corporate executives who get off. They don't get criminally prosecuted for preventable deaths and injuries in the workplace and the environment and hospital malpractice, etc. And so that's another very popular one. Law and order, crime in the suites has to be addressed. The fourth one is, how come these big corporations are on the dole? Why are they subsidized by your tax dollars?
Right.
Those tax dollars should be brought back to you in terms of jobs, repairing public services in your community, as I noted earlier. The same thing with the tax system. You have student debt now is $1.5 trillion. I mean, what kind of society launches its young generation in a sea of debt? You tell me, what kind of society? No country in Western Europe does that. You have tuition-free education in most of these countries for college or university. And so, well, how do you get rid of student debt? Well, you know, we bailed out Wall Street debt, trillions of dollars in 2008. I say we because nobody asked the taxpayer. It was forced down their throat by the Bush and Obama administration, Citigroup, Bank of America, all these crooks. They were bailed out. So why not have a jubilee for student debt? Well, who's going to pay for that? It's simple. You have a Wall Street speculation tax. Hey, Americans, don't you go into stores and pay 6, 7, 8% sales tax on things you need to buy? Yeah. Well, how come there's no sales tax if today someone buys $100 million of Exxon's bonds or Exxon derivatives? How about a sales tax of, say, 0.5%? That's pretty small. That's $300 billion, Mr. Packard. So it's all these things that really rile people's sense of unfairness and the double standard, and corporations being our masters instead of being our servants, and we the people, and the sovereignty of the people, making sure that they delegate their power with strings attached to Congress. And if you take control of Congress, the ball game starts to be over. And that's what most progressives don't understand, that like the Occupy Wall Street, you know, they trespassed and they got a lot of press because they took over Zuccotti Park, right, and other places around the country. But they didn't have an issue. So I had a conference call with 300 of them. And I said, here's your issue. It's a living wage. And they said, of course. I said, well, why don't you occupy the space around all your congressional representatives? You got all the people ready to go. And he said, well, we can't organize anything. In other words, they blew this huge opportunity in 2011 with mass media focus day after day, and they didn't focus on the one institution that can make it happen. And that's why it's the Congress people. It's the Congress people. They got to get that drilled in their head. There are only 535 of them. And on many issues, you got about 150 on your side from the get-go. And the one thing every member of Congress wants more than corporate campaign contributions is your vote. But if your vote is an uninformed vote, a stay-at-home vote, a non-focused around agenda reform vote, your vote doesn't mean much. This is what this rap book is all about. People are ordering 5 copies at a time, Mr. Packard, because I think they're discussing it in their living room. If they go to ratsreformcongress.org, they can not only get the book, but they can access free a tutorial about how to set up these Congress watchdog groups.
Right.
And it's no big deal, and nobody can stop you from doing it. And it's a lot easier than you think, and it takes less than 1% of the people to turn Congress around on issue after issue, as long as they are supported by majority opinion.
The book is fantastic. It's called How the Rats Reformed the Congress. We've been speaking with the book's author and very, very long-time activist, Ralph Nader. Ralph, thank you, as always, for being on the program.
Well, thank you for intelligent programming, and I think your listeners would love the cover. It was by Mr. Fish, who's a great cartoonist out of Philadelphia. It's a spectacular cover, and on the back are your arguing points on the critique of Congress and what has to be done. The most concise critique of Congress ever put on one page.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
So Donald Trump's personal attorney, Rudy Giuliani, who you might remember was completely pulled off of TV after one disastrous appearance after another before the Mueller report and Barr letter came out, he's been allowed back on TV, and he has had some very strange appearances in the last week with CNN's Chris Cuomo, which maybe we'll get to later in the week. But he had an absolutely off-the-rails breakdown during an interview with Chris Wallace on Fox News. Chris Wallace, one of the occasional voices of not even reason, but just some moderate level of sanity on Fox News. And Rudy Giuliani kept trying to go back to talk about Hillary Clinton and her emails during this interview. And Chris Wallace did the right thing in the context. He pushed back. And at one point, Giuliani loses his temper and he says, well, who made Robert Mueller God? And of course, the key point here is that the Mueller report says there's substantial evidence of obstruction, but as part of this fantasy world that Trump and his people continue to craft, they keep insisting it's crazy to be talking about obstruction. Take a look.
Mueller says the injury to the justice system is just as great. It doesn't matter whether there was an underlying crime. It's still obstruction.
Well, when did Mueller become God? Mueller says the injury to the justice system is still as great. There was no injury, by the way. We're talking about an inchoate crime. We're talking about something that didn't happen. There was no obstruction. Nothing was denied him. Nobody crushed cell phones like Hillary did. Nobody deleted 33,000 emails like Hillary's people did. And nobody bleached a server like Hillary did.
Just keeps going back time and time again to Hillary's emails and bleaching. And I watched the entire interview, and there must have been a dozen mentions of Hillary Clinton by Rudy Giuliani. If the report actually exonerates your client, why do you keep talking about Hillary? Because the report doesn't exonerate his client. And later, Chris Wallace turns it around on Rudy and actually says, "Who made you God?" And then there's this amazing moment where, with only 16 seconds of space between two statements, Rudy says, "Hillary committed a crime," and then immediately says, "I'm not saying she committed a crime."
You got 30 seconds. Why is that a problem for Hillary Clinton, but it isn't for Donald
Hillary
Trump?
Clinton was guilty of the underlying crime. She did crush the cell phones. She did.
Well, who made you God, as you said about Mueller?
I'm not God about Mueller. I'm just the opposite.
No. You're
voice
saying that who made Mueller God? Now you're declaring whether she was guilty or not.
I'm saying there's a difference between the two. I'm not saying she's guilty, and I'm saying there's a difference.
Well, you actually did just say she's guilty, and now you're saying you didn't say that she's guilty. I mean, this stuff is on video. It's on video, not even on different days, not even in different hours. It's 16 seconds that went by. And they're going to have to pull the guy off TV again. I don't understand how this helps Trump in any way. I know earlier sowing confusion may have been a strategy to just make it unclear what's going on and who believes what. I don't know how this helps Trump. And there's another question on the Giuliani stuff, which is there a problem that media outlets keep interviewing him? What I mean is Trump quoted, Rudy Giuliani quoted Trump one day a few months ago. And the next day, when he was asked to defend that quote, said, "Oh, no, that wasn't an actual quote of Trump. That was a hypothetical quote of Trump." Should corporate media simply have said, "No more Rudy Giuliani," because this is not providing anything of value to anybody if he quotes someone and then the next day says, "It wasn't really a quote, it was a hypothetical quote of what Trump could have or would have told me"? Chris Wallace sort of doing what he should here, although, again, existing as a voice of sometimes dissent within a very narrow parameter on Fox News. But big picture, there's a question of whether Rudy Giuliani should even be interviewed on corporate media, period. Let me know what you think. Hey, this is just a quick funny thing I want to call to your attention. I got an email yesterday from Kaylin, who watches the show and also watches the great Anthony Fantano. You might remember Anthony Fantano because he's been on the show before years ago. He did a special with former producer Lewis where they reviewed heavy metal albums. And he has two really big YouTube channels. One called The Needle Drop, where he does exclusively movie reviews and music reviews and music-related content. More than 1 million subscribers. Hugely successful channel. Then he has another channel called Fantano, which is much smaller than The Needle Drop, but still has more subscribers than we do. And he talks about more things outside of music, including a video about how to be articulate. And halfway through the video, he gives the David Pakman Show a shout out. And a bunch of people emailed me and said, "Hey, Anthony Fantano sent me. He talked about you." Check out the very nice part of the clip from Anthony's channel.
Be present while you're talking. Think about all of the things that you're saying and what they are going to communicate, who you are saying them to. So I would highly recommend James Randi. I would highly recommend David Pakman over on the David Pakman YouTube channel. He has a great political YouTube channel that, in my opinion, is very fair, very balanced. And while I do watch a lot of different political YouTube channels, David Pakman, in my opinion, is one of the best in terms of just having very clean, very even speech and tone and delivery. It's very calming. It's very easy to digest. It's not very heated or aggressive or sort of out of pocket or anything like that. And look, there are some political YouTubers who I like who, do get heated in their delivery. I do like to see maybe some, Young Turks every once in a while. I do like to watch Kyle over at Secular Talk, and this is not a diss to them, but I don't necessarily watch those channels because I think the delivery is super articulate or anything like that. I would say it's more passionate than it is articulate. But if you're going to take the time to listen to other people speak, just make sure they're individuals who you think are speaking well, actually speaking well.
Good advice. Great segment. Check out the Anthony Fantano channel. Check out also The Needle Drop. It's all great stuff, and really appreciate that he mentioned me. And he every once in a while shows up in the super chats on our occasional YouTube live streams, and really appreciate it. And go check out his work because it's really, really good. Okay, we've got a voicemail number. That number is 219-2-DAVID-P. Here's a voicemail I got yesterday about Christian financial advice dude Dave Ramsey. Take a listen to this.
Hey, David, I don't know if this would be possible, but I would love to see a debate between you and Dave Ramsey where you talked about some of the financial advice that he gives, and I know you've contested in the past. So I think it would be really sweet to see a debate between you two. So if there's any way to get them on, I don't know. If the audience would like it, they see what they want to do, but I think it would be a pretty popular video.
Yeah, I don't know about interviewing or debating Dave Ramsey, but I will talk about him a little bit. So Dave Ramsey is a biblically based financial advice guy, and he has a massive, massive following built up on a lot of these conservative and Christian radio stations where he gives financial advice. And there's a significant similarity between Dave Ramsey and Jordan Peterson, and I'll explain what I mean by that. Most of what Dave Ramsey says or gives out as advice is not bad advice. Okay, most of it. There's some bad advice which I'll talk about it, but in the same way that Jordan Peterson has repackaged sort of fairly obvious advice in a way that appeals to, in Peterson's case, it's disproportionately these disaffected white men, Dave Ramsey has repackaged mostly obvious and very old, quite frankly, financial advice. Avoiding interest is like earning interest. Avoiding paying interest on a loan is like earning interest on an investment. Pay off your high interest rate debt first if you can. And he's repackaged it with his biblical stuff to a Christian audience. He regularly does his speaking engagements at churches and this type of thing. A lot of what Jordan Peterson says is the same advice that's been around for a long time from people who maybe presented it in a less PR-friendly way. In the same way, a lot of Dave Ramsey's advice is the same as what Mr. Money Mustache, a financial blogger who's completely non-religious and on the left, named Pete Adney, says, who I've interviewed on the program. The advice in and of itself is not really the problem. I mean, it's simple stuff. If you don't have $1,000 saved as an emergency fund, you have an emergency. All discretionary spending ends immediately until you get that $1,000 in your emergency fund. Mr. Money Mustache says that. Dave Ramsey says that in almost the same wording. The thing about Ramsey is that it's mostly advice that's tailored to people who could afford to own a house based on the cost of living where they live, and who are in sort of a particular situation. More and more, there are kind of urban millennials falling for the Dave Ramsey stuff, but originally that was not his audience. His audience was kind of like the rural, potentially homeowning, drives to work rather than takes public transit type of person. But he is appealing to more and more people as time goes by. And I don't have a major problem with Dave Ramsey other than there's no reason for what he does to be coded with Christianity, right? He has this thing Dave Ramsey does, where you do a debt snowball, which we don't have to talk about what it is, but you do a debt snowball to get out of debt. And when you get out of debt, you do a debt-free scream, which is coded with being born again in Christianity, right? So the advice is simple. It's pay off your debt in a particular way, live below your means so that you can save money, and eventually you'll be in a better financial position. Not remarkable in any way. I don't like the Christianity that's surrounding it. Sometimes, though, he actually gives bad advice. So an example would be, if you can contribute to a 401k that your employer matches, that's free money. And you always want to prioritize that over paying off every dollar in debt. right? If your portfolio 401k is going to return somewhere between 8 and 9% over the long term, and your employer is offering to match that with free money, you don't necessarily want to just throw money at a mortgage on which you might pay 4%. You're better off taking the free money in a match from your employer and earning what over the long term would be 8 to 9%. So I have some specific disagreements with Dave Ramsey, but for the most part, the religious approach to just basic, uncontroversial financial advice is not something I find necessary or remotely interesting. That's my Dave Ramsey rant. We've got a great bonus show for you today. Become a member, become a patron, and I'll see you then.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.